Well, good morning. We're here today once again with Bob Reeder, and we're studying a little bit about how the Bible came to be. And last week we had a nice introduction, and today we're going to continue that study. And Bob, what you want to give us a brief overview of exactly what it is that we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. This was going to be my first quiz question if it was an actual class is, what language was the Hebrew Bible written in? And I'm sure that that we'd had 100% A's, which would have said Hebrew. So today, very few of us read Hebrew. So today, what we're going to try to walk through at the 10,000 foot level is how did we get from the Hebrew Bible to the English Bible? And we'll walk through that because that's this whole series of steps, fascinating steps that as a history major, I find really fascinating.
All right, well, good. We'll look forward to this today. And I put up on the screen the outline that we're going to follow, and I'll just leave that there for the remainder of our time this morning. But I see in number one, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've always enjoyed that consideration of the Dead Sea Scrolls in part because of the way it came about that they were discovered. And this apparently on the Qumran community apparently had the scrolls. One day, a young boy was herding goats along the banks of the Dead Sea, which were cliffs with caves built into it, and he lost a goat, and he was looking for that goat and didn't want to get in trouble, so he was checking out all the caves to make sure the goat hadn't wandered into a cave, and he threw a rock in to see if he could chase the goat out of a particular cave, and heard the breaking of some pottery. And so he wandered in and he found what they called, they called them jars, but they were
amphora.
What I'm saying again?
Amphora.
Amphora. Okay, and to be somewhat equivalent to our vases, as we say today, and inside were these scrolls, and thus the Dead Sea, the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what they was a collection of ancient writings, and they turned out to be the scriptures that they used in their worship from centuries ago. And they discovered those, and then they started taking them apart, and they realized what a find they had here. And I think the boy was exonerated from losing that goat because I think they made up for it in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
It's a good trade-off.
Yeah. Bob, can you tell us exactly what's involved with the Dead Sea Scrolls? What goes on with them?
Sure. The first thing that I think, sometimes it's good to state the obvious. There are no first editions of the Hebrew Bible extant today. So if you're looking for the, quote, original writing, you will not find it today. And in fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are from about the period of 3 or 4 BCE, right before the switch from before Christ to after Christ, up through about 100 CE, Common Era. So these are still, while old, are still 700 or some 800 years after, for example, the minor prophets existed and wrote. So we are still way off the timeline, so to speak, even when we go back as far as we do with the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Now, Bob, let me ask you something. Were there any New Testament documents in there, or is it entirely Old Testament?
No New Testament. It's all Old Testament. And I want to make that clear, and I'll be a little more specific, of all of the scrolls and the fragments and portions of the scrolls that they found, there was 225 were Old Testament text, but there were hundreds and hundreds of other writings. So it is not pure, quote, scripture, even just limited to the Old Testament scripture.
I see.
So there was a lot of other scrolls of other procedures and what they did at this Qumran facility and the like. So it's not just scripture.
Okay, all right. And did these serve to, I know the textual critics, those who would try to take the Bible apart, they were very nearly foaming at the mouth to get their hands on these Dead Sea Scrolls to prove the Bible was fallacious. What did they discover from these Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, it's like most things in life, I guess, neither all good nor all bad. Clearly, it was not proven to be fallacious, but nor is it a, quote, panacea for someone who tries to go back and say, look, I'd like to see what the original book of Amos said.
Right.
As I said, you're 700 and some years after that. So there are clearly differences, but no substantive differences, if you will.
Yeah.
In terms of what the Dead Sea Scrolls showed. It can be a little more specific. About 40% of the fragments are of the Hebrew Bible. So that means there's like 60% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are not part of the Hebrew Bible. All the scrolls, and I should say they're all in scroll format. We'll talk a little bit later on this morning about, and I have trouble pronouncing it, uncials. Is that right?
Yep,
or
yep.
close?
Yep. Very good.
Uncial, we'll say, we'll define it later on, but it's like a leaf of a book. These were all scrolls. That is to say, they were rolled up and inserted in these amphora or jars, and they were either on parchment or vellum, which is animal hide, animal skin has been treated. Some were in papyrus, which is literally early paper, and you can imagine how difficult it is to keep that where you can read it after all those number of years. Yeah. And most amazingly, we don't have time to get into it, one scroll was in copper. So it's kind of fascinating, but they were all in scroll form. While there are 225 fragments of the Bible, none of the scrolls contain a full book of the Hebrew Bible. So there's no, like, if you wanted to go back and say, gee whiz, is there? Well, maybe Deuteronomy isn't there, but is Amos there? There's no full book of the Old Testament there.
Okay.
The scroll does, go ahead.
Well, I was going to push us on just a little bit. I noticed that the second, your second item, the Crown of Aleppo Codex, was that among the scrolls that were found?
No, that's a total from Roman numeral 1 in the outline to Roman numeral 2 in the outline. It is a very different beast completely. But it's really a critical document. Again, I always try to divide it. This is only the Hebrew Bible. This is only our Old Testament. There is no New Testament portion in the Aleppo Codex. And one might, and I'm sure you're going to ask me, Bob, what's a codex?
Bob, what's a codex?
The codex is, unlike a scroll, which we described before, a codex is a leaf where one side is one page. It's where we get our terminology, where we get books from, because they're leaves that are either stitched together or glued together on one side, okay, so they can be turned as pages of a book, as opposed to unrolled as a scroll.
Okay, I see.
The Aleppo Codex is accepted, I think, universally as the oldest extant Hebrew Bible that has existed to modern times. Now, I did not say that it's complete. It is not complete, but it is the oldest. It goes back to approximately, and this is kind of interesting, 930 Common Era. So that's like 1,000 years after the birth of Christ. So it is not, again, 1,000 years after that. There's still 750 years before that, before you got to the minor prophets like that. In Hebrew, it is called Keter, K-E-T-E-R, Aram, and Tova, T-O-T-Z-O-V-A, which just means Keter is crown. Aram is the word for Syria, and we'll talk about that a lot in the class. And Tovia is just district. So it is a geographical location. So it's a crown of Aleppo, which is that geographical location. Uh, it was transcribed, I'll use the word created. I'm not sure that that would stand hard questioning, but it's not just to our knowledge that pure copying, which a scribe might do, but it's actually a creation of a group of scribes called the Masoretes. Very important in terms of biblical history. It was a community of scribes from Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee in Israel. And it comes, as I said, from about 930 Common Era. And it comes from the Hebrew word Masora, M-A-S-O-R-A, which means tradition. And the uniqueness, if you will, of this Aleppo Codex is that when Hebrew was originally written, it was written without any vowels, and it was written without any indication of how the word or words should be pronounced.
Yeah.
And over as time went by, that created confusion and inconsistencies.
It does. Listen, I'll tell you this. As one who studied the Hebrew language, it also was very confusing to those of us in first year Hebrew.
Well, I'm glad I'm not the only one to do that, for sure. But the Masoretes, they, in this community in about 930, they put in the vowels, and they put in what are called intonations, which were indications of how the word should be how the word should be pronounced. And maybe, at least from our viewpoint, it put in descriptions and text, if you will, explanations of the text and where things, how they got to that point in time. It's kind of like, for those of us who were raised on the Scofield Bible, it was the first Scofield Bible of its day.
Oh, it's a study Bible.
Yes, it is. Exactly right.
Wow.
And that's what really makes it very unique. And it starts to show the history and the tradition of how they got to. And that's why it is now accepted as the most authoritative, receptive text of the Hebrew Bible, because it has these vowels, intonations, and also has the text that describes how it got there, the verbal, the meaning of it.
Those intonations they refer to as pointings.
Yes.
And that was it was very difficult to learn those pointings, and because they help with the parsing of the verbs, to know what tense they are, and it made it way more pronounceable, but it made it also very difficult to try to take the words and the sentences apart.
For those of you who may have been to a bar or bat mitzvah,
yes,
you will note that the boy or girl, first of all, the Jews will not touch the Torah. And that's why they have this little pointer. Yeah. They don't touch it. It's on a scroll, it's unrolled, but you don't put your finger and point to it. You have this pointer that does that. And you will see they go to class for a full year or so in order to be able to read a very small section that they use at their bar or bat mitzvah. But that's the pointer that you're talking about.
I see.
Got to go to a few more bar mitzvahs, John.
Well, I know. I have to admit I have not been to all that many, and most of my friends were Roman Catholic rather than Jewish. Bob, as we scoot down here, I'm looking at the Hebrew Bible in Greek, and one of the things I've had occasion to talk about recently has been that it's one thing to conquer a world. It's quite another thing to maintain or hold the territory that you've conquered. And Alexander the Great was one who was said to have conquered the world by the age of 29. And the phrase goes, and Alexander wept because there are no more worlds to conquer. But Alexander was also a very bright and learned guy. Aristotle was one of his teachers. And he chose a methodology of trying to hang on to his kingdom by teaching everybody a common language, which meant that the literature of the day had to be translated into the Greek language. And that was somewhere around 300 plus or minus BC. And that led to your next topic, the Septuagint.
Turning over my notes here. Yes, the Septuagint is up to this point, we've studied Hebrew Bible into Hebrew, and that's what we've done.
Into Greek.
No, we've done up to this point.
Just yeah. I'm sorry. Right. You're right.
The Septuagint is the first out of Hebrew to Hebrew. We're now going from Hebrew to Greek.
Thank you. Yes.
And it is, as we've discussed already up to this point in time, only the Old Testament. The Septuagint is like that. Correct. The Jewish legend, and I hope I don't get drummed out of the church for this, if you study the Apostles' Creed, there's at least a Christian legend out there that each of the 12 apostles wrote one of the sections of the Apostles' Creed. That's legend. I don't think any biblical scholar, Christian or otherwise, or religious scholar accepts that as exactly what happened like that. Well, in the Jewish, they also have a legend is that there were 72 scholars that were pulled together in order to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And obviously at that point in time, this was done in Alexander. And as people dispersed from Israel and Judah and Israel, and time went by, less and less were able to speak and read Hebrew. So this translation into Greek was allegedly done by, or legendarily done by 72 Jewish scholars, put in 72 separate rooms, and miraculously, at the end of a period of time, 70 days, I believe it was, they all came out with the exact same translation. And again, I think that's more legend than not, but it is a critical step where the Hebrew Bible was first taken out of its original language and into the Greek.
And that word, that prefix, the septa in that has to do with the 70. I believe that's a Latin prefix there, isn't it? Septa being Latin.
I don't want to review my grades in first and second year Latin right now.
Okay, well, I don't want to do my Greek and Hebrew either, but.
Like
but septa being I think it simply means 70 out of the Latin language.
Exactly right. One of the interesting things is the people who made that translation, whether it was 1 or 70 or however many that actually did it, that is the first time that these 7 deuterocanonical books entered into the corpus, if you will, of Scripture, and they have been rarely, variously called deuterocanonical, which just means later added to the canon, and some refer to them as apocrypha, which are, generally speaking, books that are not accepted as inspired at all by anyone. But that's where the first time you get, we discussed last week, there were 24 books in Hebrew, but the Septuagint had 24 plus these additional 7 books.
All right. Okay.
So that was.
We have about 5 minutes left. Is there any highlight that you want to share with us about the Septuagint?
No, I think it's just the first jump, if you will, from Hebrew into another language. And fortunately, it was done in Alexander, and Greek was a language that people read and used, and therefore it was maintained. And that's the quote beauty of it.
Yeah, and that certainly facilitated the work of the gospel as it went forward into the Roman Empire, which was the holdover from the Greek Empire. So it was very useful because Greek was the lingua franca, or the common language of the day.
Vernacular, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Bob, where are we going to go next week?
Next week, we are going to, again, at 10,000 feet, talk a little bit about the historical errors that we are studying in the Old Testament. We're going to compare it to most of us in with regard to Europe, for example. We know the Age of the Enlightenment. We know the Reformation. We know these large blocks of time that are out there. I think if we move to the Levant, including the southern Levant, most of us would get hung up a little bit and not have a very clear understanding of what some of these large blocks of time are. Because again, we're trying to fit this as kind of a prequel into the Minor Prophets class. It's going to start, I'll give a plug, October 1st, Thursday night. And this will help put us in the context, where does this slice of history, because it is history, it is theology, but it's also history, fit both compared to Europe and what was going on in the ancient Near East.
All right. Well, good. We'll look forward to that next week, and we'll look forward to a gander at some unctuals. I see that's going to be at the top of the list for us next week.
Okay. All right. Great. Always a pleasure. Have a good week.
Bob, I appreciate it. Thank you for sharing with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you back here next week. We'll see you Sunday too, but we'll see you back next week.
Okay.
All right. Great. God bless you. Bye-bye.